So in the end, loans were given to companies who maybe would not be able to repay their loans, and loans were also given to the subprime market, or people who were taking out mortgages who should never ever have been given those mortgages, because there was no way they were ever going to be able to pay those mortgages back. So stage 2 was the growth of financial instruments. Now, when I was in investment banking myself, I was actively involved in a lot of these sort of products that the banks were generating and creating. So we saw like credit default swaps, CDOs, and CDO squareds, and CDOs on CDSs, and we saw all these complex products being developed, which a lot of people didn't really actually understand, or especially they didn't understand in the environments when the markets would suddenly be very, very volatile. So what we saw is that these complex instruments were being developed, and the banks started to increase their lending. Their leverage ratios were going very, very high. So they were lending more and more, and because they wanted to lend more, they were lending to less creditworthy companies and less creditworthy mortgage borrowers. We then saw the rise of hedge funds. I teach a lot on hedge funds at my university, and the hedge funds were actively trading in these sorts of markets, in these derivative markets, and they were making huge amounts of money, but this was a few years ago. So the stage 3 was the house price bubble, and fundamentally this is what everyone blames the current financial crisis on. They blame the current financial crisis on the subprime mortgage lending that occurred in the United States. But this subprime lending, remember, was really because of what the banks had been doing, and they had been lending to these people. House prices started rocketing. More and more people were getting mortgages, so there was more and more demand for mortgages and for houses, so house prices were going up and up and up. And so people were selling their houses and making stacks of money. You know, their house price, they would have bought it for, say, 100,000 a couple of years ago, and now they were selling it for 500,000. So a lot of people made a lot of personal money out of selling their houses. So a lot of money was made. And what did they do? Well, they might have saved it. Few did. A lot started spending it on yachts and all sorts of luxuries, and the others remortgaged and bought ever bigger properties. Next. So the next crisis was all the loan defaults. So borrowers couldn't keep up their payments, and everyone says, well, that was the subprime market in the United States. But actually it was also companies who were finding it increasingly difficult to pay their loans. Now, the loans that companies had at the time sometimes were on very, very advantageous rates, because the banks were creating all these derivatives on the loans that they were doing. The banks were able to offer loans that were very, very cheap. So at the end, the bank credit ratings fell, their capital adequacy requirements fell, and we saw that people started worrying about doing deals with banks, putting their money on deposit with banks and doing anything with the banks. So the public loses confidence. But it wasn't just the public losing confidence in the banks were losing confidence in other banks. And so the liquidity squeeze that we have at the moment is purely because the banks are too afraid to lend to each other. So none of them want to lend to each other, and so the governments are having to come in and say, look, to the banks, we'll give you some money, please lend this money to companies. Companies need that money. Companies need working capital. Companies need money for investments, for growth. But we know that the banks aren't really taking that on board. So some people say that have the banks now become too big to manage, where they're all downsizing at the moment. Every day in the papers we're seeing massive, massive layoffs in the banks. So the banks are very, very much downsizing, and so maybe the banks will be manageable in the future. So stage 5 of the financial meltdown. Now, maybe in the UK, we started it off because we had an organisation called Northern Rock, and it was on the front page of, I think, the Worldwide News, all the massive queues of people trying to take their money out of Northern Rock. So it was a run on the bank, and that was really the first stage of this financial crisis. Then we saw Bear Stearns, a major financial organisation, be nationalised by the US government. The two big lending organisations for mortgages, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, sort of had major problems in August. Lehman Brothers was allowed to fold. Now, lots of people say Lehman Brothers maybe should not have been allowed to fold, because if Lehman had not folded, maybe the rest of the problems wouldn't have occurred. Because the US government allowed Lehman's to fold, people were worried that the government would allow other banks to fold as well. So September started, all the mergers, all the downsizing, which was mainly in the US. Yes, Maria? Yeah. And in October, we saw the $700 billion bailout announced by the US government, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, to buy out all these toxic assets, i.e. all these loans that had defaulted, held by the banks. So we saw that happen in October. We also saw Iceland, a country, actually go bust, and this was a European country. So a European country goes bust. A lot of UK savers were personally affected by the collapse of this. In November, we've seen interest rates really get reduced all around the world. In the UK, we had a really big reduction in our interest rate, which took everybody by surprise. The US government changes its mind. Originally, it was meant to give liquidity to the financial system in the United States, but then it decided that it was actually going to recapitalize the banks. So if they're recapitalizing the banks, then it's very unlikely that the banks are going to continue lending. So there's a big question over what should the US government be doing. Should it be recapitalizing the banks, or should it be helping more, say, the people who can't pay their mortgages, who are losing their houses and now have nowhere to live? So where should that $700 billion be spent? You know, who should it be helping out? And is it bailing out the banks who've made stacks of money in the past, or should it be helping those poor homeowners? So moral hazard comes in there as to who should the governments support. So we're now in a global recession. I think everyone has realised that. The global recession has affected everybody globally. It will hit all of us, maybe not as directly as other people, but I think we are all trying to be more economical with what we are now doing. So we think unemployment is going to rise dramatically. Global trade and investment will be affected. Now, obviously, different regions and different countries will be affected differently from others, so it won't be generally across all countries. The recession won't be as bad as the 1930s, which was extremely bad, especially for Europe, but it's probably going to be the worst we have seen in say 60, 70 years. So, don't think that this is just going to last for a few months. I don't think it is.